This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Mid-Atlantic region and beyond. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything, from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 294 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with landscape architect Thomas Rainier about designing plant systems. The plant profile is on dwarf comfrey, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on Secret Letters of the Garden from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Thomas Rainier, landscape architect. Welcome, Thomas.
Thanks, Kathy. Happy to be here.
Great to have you on, and we're going to discuss all things designing plant systems in a little bit. But first, we want to know about you, Thomas, and we're going to dial it all the way back to the beginning. Were you born with chlorophyll in your veins and a green thumb?
Yeah, I was definitely one of those kids who was like saving my apple seeds to go out in the yard and plant them. When I got a little older, I was a suburban kid, and our cul-de-sac backed up to a fairly large forested tract of land owned by a steel company who didn't do very much with it. So kind of a prototypical kid in the woods. And I would roam those woods with a pack of semi-feral neighborhood boys, always, just exploring. So my earliest memories of plants were less as botanical specimens and more as landscapes, like plants in the wild. And I have very specific memories of very specific places, like this grove of Ilex arborea, these sparkleberries, which is really, it's like a thicket. And we would move through them like rabbits would, kind of crawl on our hands and knees through the tangled branches. Or another spot, remember we'd go over this ridge, and in this little creek valley was just, all these gorgeous beaches kind of glowing with their kind of that absinthe color they have. And for a bunch of irreverent butthead boys, I kind of remember like how quiet all of us would get, walking in there. So those experiences really kind of, I think, pulled me into not just plants, but like how plants shape environments, how they shape worlds, and how those worlds affect us emotionally. That was definitely some of my early hooks.
Nice. And what was the first thing you remember growing for yourself?
Tomatoes. I mean, I think a lot of people like vegetables were the entry, food plants were kind of the entry gateway, something I could like pick and do. A neighbor behind me was a really good tomato gardener, and he was always very patient, and he would share, seedlings or other things. So yeah, it was the thrill of growing something to eat that got me initially.
And what brought you to landscape architecture as a profession?
It was kind of a weird path. I was so certain I was going to be a lawyer. I was, an English and philosophy major in undergraduate. And I worked in a law firm my last year of college, and I just hated it. It was just, it was not at all being Perry Mason or what I thought it was going to be. And I was kind of scrambling. I didn't want to start working. I wanted to go to school longer. And a friend of mine in college, his father was a landscape architect. And I spoke with him. At the time, I had worked in a nursery kind of all through my teen years and knew I really loved plants, but it really seemed to kind of connect with some philosophy classes I was taking about kind of how democracy actually needs public space to thrive. Like you actually need the physical settings that hold communities together, not isolated like we are with our screens as much. And I remember that class kind of opening my brain to like, wow, public space is not, or shaping space, creating space, designing space is not just about decoration and ornament. It's, kind of could be civic. And anyways, it was just I applied to University of Georgia and got in, and it was a 3-year program. So Athens was a cool town, and major life decision made on, kind of a whim, but it has really worked out. I'm glad I did it.
And I just visited Athens, Georgia with the Azalea Society of America. That was their annual conference this year, and got to visit again Dr. Durr's garden, got to visit Dr. Ellen Armitage's home garden.
Yes.
It is a great college town, wonderful plant school. And were either of those your professors back then?
So they teach in horticulture, not in landscape architecture, but I knew, Durr is such a legend. So I kind of audited a class. I couldn't get it for credit, but I would go around with him, and he was amazing. Just his campus tours, identifying plants. I remember one time he had this, story, because he wanted you to analyze how branch densities were in trees and how different they were. And he had these like wild stories about, I guess he didn't like cats, but grabbing a cat by the tail and swinging it up, and how many branches, if you threw it straight up from under the tree, how many branches would the cat hit? I mean, just like an absurd story, but like it's stuck in my head because every time now it makes you see branch density now in a way that I never really noticed before. He's a great teacher and a great mind. So I was lucky to be there. The other one was Daryl Morrison, who's a really amazing, he was the professor who taught planting design at University of Georgia. And he was one of the first advocates of native plants, really starting back in the 60s, especially as a landscape architect. And he was amazing. He took us on this Maymester class the entire class was just to spend 4 weeks going from, it was like a dozen different sites in the wild. And Daryl knew the best places, like the most primal, like portions of forest from the heights of Mount Mitchell in North Carolina to the swamps of Okefenokee. He knew these sites that were as close to probably pre-Columbian versions, like real, like groves, and the Appalachians had these almost like rainforest. And you just realize like how much of what we call nature, or the kind of woods I grew up in as a child, was a heavily traumatized landscape. Like what I thought was nature was really a very young, frequently logged, early successional, version. And these places Daryl took us to were like, wow, this is what, things were like, before kind of such heavy disturbance that we've created. So that was an amazing class. And it kind of being in Georgia was amazing, between Durr and then Daryl and some of those places. It was a great place to get my start.
And you got to see all those native azaleas in situ in some of those, stream valleys and not so accessible places. That must have been incredible. And the scent must be great too.
Yes.
And so you're speaking about some of the history of naturalistic gardens and native garden movement. And you were saying about in the 1960s, but I was going to dial it all the way back to William Robinson.
Yeah.
And his influence in his book at the turn of from the 19th to the 20th century. Yeah,
that book is fascinating. I had read it. It's been, 10 or 15 years, but when I finally read it, what was so surprising to me was the premise was so different than what I thought it was about, because so much of what he's writing about is about taking exotics and placing them into the wild landscape in kind of very naturalistic forms.
Mm-hmm.
It was really interesting kind of thinking about, like how do you make peonies work in a rough grass? Like how can you make these kind of, it's almost like vignettes. If anyone's never looked at that book, the little hand sketches, I can't remember if Robinson did or someone else did it. They're these little black and white vignettes of plants in the wild, or exotic plants kind of placed in ditches and places out in the landscape. Those little hand sketches are worth the book alone. I mean, they're just so poetic. And dense with possibility.
Yeah, and if you've ever visited Winterthur, that was based on his work.
Interesting.
And the book is The Wild Garden. You can still get it everywhere.
Yes.
And I like the description on Amazon is a comprehensive guide to naturalizing hardy exotic plants and creating wild gardens, featuring detailed information about the British wildflowers. So he did incorporate, because he's writing from Britain, of course, their wildflowers. So that kind of introduced that thinking to, I think it was the DuPonts, and at least at Winterthur. Well, back to you. And so you became a landscape architect, but let's talk a little bit about where you're gardening now and the conditions and what you're growing.
Yeah, I have a tiny city garden. I live in Arlington, Virginia, in kind of a 1950s ranch house. So it's on the corner next to a bus route. So, there's sections of my garden that's kind of screening from a busy road. And a lot of that's about kind of using a lot of natives and kind of a natural woodland edge, loose hedge kind of environment, just a buffer. And then have a smaller area next to a road and driveway. This kind of my more ornamental garden. And in that one, I recently just redid it just to make the maintenance low. It's essentially just a grove of like 4 sweet bay magnolias with a very low kind of herbaceous carpet. And the last time I redid it, I tried to keep everything, 12 to 24 inches tall, really short. And then everything, it's a perennial mix, but everything is winter present as possible. Because one of the things I was realizing was I was having so much weed pressure from things that came out late in the summer or late in the spring, I guess I'd say. So that whole time from kind of January to June, I was having a lot of weed pressure. So now like a more winter present, I wouldn't call it evergreen, but like winter present base. And it's amazing how much more, how much less weeding it is. So that's been really nice.
We'll have to share some of those tips and tricks.
Sure.
And so for most of our listeners who are in the mid-Atlantic, but maybe some are overseas and might not know, Arlington, Virginia, of course, is directly south of Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Right on below the Potomac, and you're zone 7. I'm going to venture that you might be bordering on 8.
Yeah, there's definitely I have some adventure zone pushing right against the kind of the southwest foundation of my house is my place. Although last winter was quite cruel to several of my zone pushing adventures that had survived for the better part of a decade, but last winter corrected my
yes,
my ways.
Many of us had a reset on that. And are you on the clay side of the soil or the
Definitely
sandy
clay.
side?
Very heavy clay.
And you are basically working for yourself, correct? In your own firm?
Yes, we started in 2017. Fido Studio is a partnership with my wife, Melissa Rayner, who's kind of the managing director, and Claudia West, who some listeners might know, who was my co-author on a book earlier. And so after we had the book and doing talks, we really kind of felt like we would like to put into practice a lot of the things we were writing and thinking about and kind of experimenting on the side in our previous jobs. Fido's really... It's a landscape architecture firm, but more than half of our projects, we work as a horticultural subconsultant, very often to other landscape architects. So if a landscape architect is doing master planning on a public garden, we'll come in and do the planting design on a specific garden. Or a big waterfront project in New York, and they're doing all the engineering and hardscape and that kind of stuff. We'll come in and do, like a stylized meadow or something specific for them. So we're kind of a horticultural gun for hire on some larger projects. That's not when it's not kind of residential or kind of garden scale.
So most of them are larger scale, not home landscapes.
Yeah, we try to do, if it's not kind of residential, we try to do almost only either institutional or public work, never developer work. And for us, that's just about being able to kind of deliver the procurement and the quality that's needed. So that includes sites like we're doing several waterfront project in New York City. Example right now is raising some of this the seawalls around the edges of the city where Hurricane Sandy had created issues. So those are being reconstructed with bike trails and all kinds of kind of pedestrian amenities. But the city wants the plantings to be highly resilient, but yet still beautiful because they're narrow. And so we'll do like the planting design on projects like that. We just finished a project in the Battery Park in New York where they raised the seawall 5 feet and had some narrow plantings along there. Sometimes we do a lot of public garden work. So when landscape architects are called in kind of to do planning, master planning, especially for a new addition or rethinking existing collections, we come in on that. So we're working in Toronto Botanic Garden right now and Columbus, Ohio, and Franklin Park on some new ones. We just completed a garden in Richmond, Virginia, Lewis Ginter down there, a new stylized meadow. So yeah, it's fun. I love the public garden clients just because, working with horticulturalists, they have the ability to procure super well and maintain at a high level. So we can do more adventurous plantings in those settings than we could for municipal clients.
And we, the public, get to visit those. So
Yeah.
Definitely interested in seeing the Battery Park installation as well as Lewis Ginter soon. And for those listeners who aren't familiar with the book that you co-authored with Claudia West, that's Planting in a Post-Wild World.
Yes.
And I'll have linked to that in the show notes. And you mentioned in a pre-interview that we did, Thomas, that you're working on another book. Is that with Claudia as well?
It is. Yep. It's kind of a follow-up to Planting in a Post-Wild World. We feel like we've learned a lot with our practice in the last 10 years. And there are other things, just the last one came out in 2015, but I think there are other kind of realities that we're seeing with climate change that are causing us to want to reframe, we're not abandoning any of the ideas of the previous ones, but just reframe in a more relevant way, ways in which plantings need to adapt to the kind of conditions we're facing. So we'll be wrapping that up. Will be with Rizzoli. We'll turn that in September. And I would guess in 2028 it would be published.
Okay. And do you have a working title of that?
Yeah, we're calling it Future Nature.
Future Nature. All right. So look forward to that, listeners, and get your pre-order in as soon as that is posted online. And so let's dive into our topic of designing plant systems. And I almost wanted to say designing plant communities. So Thomas, what is the difference in your opinion between a system and a community, and why not say communities?
Well, communities is still relevant. It's still kind of the dominant way that people think about it, and even in colleges do that. Part of what we are interested in doing is to move a discussion of ecology, like what makes plants more ecological, away from ideology. And so I think there are certain ideologies that are really embedded in a lot of popular gardening culture. I'll just give you one example. And this is, we think native plants are essential, really, really important. The idea that the word native is the only way to understand a plant's ecological value, right? Like where that is shorthand, really, in some ways, right? For trying to understand a plant that is local, a plant that's evolved to, what do we mean by native? Is a plant that's evolved to the local conditions, a plant that should be tolerant to the habitat of the local area, or climate, all those kind of shorthand things, should have evolved relationships with fauna. And it does. So it's useful in that way. But in many ways, I feel like that is one of the only frameworks we have for evaluating ecological quality. And I see this in my profession all the time. I'll go to landscapes where a landscape architect has installed a monoculture of some really low quality native plants, like native cultivars or hybrids that really are low in the list of species that support a lot of fauna, for example. And they get a LEED Gold rating or LEED Platinum rating because they check the box of using a native plant. And it doesn't really answer, is it resilient? Are those species that they're doing other functions other than, being native from the same thing? No. So, that, and even just the idea of community itself, which kind of, I think, assumes a bit of a kumbaya harmony between plants. So if you take a plant from the same community and plop it in your garden, you import the same kind of virtue, kind of virtuous, right? And in that kind of sense. And what we'd rather people do is just kind of evaluate plants, because there's so many environmental stresses right now. There's so much to deal with climate change, that we really need to think more broadly about what ecological function means. And so what we're trying to kind of come up with is a distilled systems version. It's like thinking of plants and plant assemblies more like an engine of a car. If you think about your engine of the car, different parts have different functions. The carburetor does something, the pistons do something else. All the different pieces work together, they're complementary. And right now, a big part of what we think we need is these kind of green carpets covering ground. And we want to, pay more attention to the ways they cover ground, how they function together, how they interlock, how they overlap, how they create redundancy so that when climate change heats up and some species start disappearing, there are functional substitutes, like what else could fill that same working role? So if it's really about building plant list less based on origin and more based on functional roles, ecological roles that go together. Ecological and aesthetic. We still need aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I love that. Yeah, I think that talking about the function of the plant and how it can be beneficial to the environment is a great place to start.
Yes. And there's many functional roles. I mean, there are plants that both native and non-native, but there's some plants that are better at absorbing stormwater than others. There are some plants that remove pollutants from or rain gardens better than others. There's some plants that are super pollinator plants. There are plants with all of these. I mean, plants are amazing. They're just loaded with functions. And so if we start thinking about building plant lists based on roles, like the roles they play, almost like if you're thinking about an actor, you're having roles within the play. If one actor gets sick on another day, a different actor can come in and fulfill that same role. We kind of need that in a climate change way. I mean, I was just walking through a beech forest here in the mid-Atlantic, not too far from here, and could see how many, I think, like 70% of the trees in this part of this hike were beeches, and they all have beech leaf disease right now. That right now there's no cure for that. So that just might go, right? So we're in an era where we have to think not just about what existed before in that exact native spot and pulling them here. We have to think about functional substitutes. And that really draws more attention to the role they play in the system and how we can build kind of plantings based on a diverse set of roles.
And those could be natives that are a zone south of us.
Exactly.
That could be something that was bred.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about kind of southern assisted migration, because it's true, just like the urban heat island effects, like Washington, D.C., in terms of its urban heat island, is effectively more like Panhandle, Florida, in terms of its heat, with the kind of the additional heat that's there. Now, we can't have the hardiness zone of Panhandle, Florida, but there are certain oaks, for example, that are in our range in Virginia and, also grow all the way down to like coastal Alabama, for example. And those might be, some of the better selections. So again, kind of evaluating a tree in your garden based on these functional roles. Hey, does it still support all the Lepidoptera that we want an oak to support? Yes. Can it still live in our hardiness zone? Yes. But is this population more kind of heat tolerant and southern from here? Yes, that might be a good functional substitute for a northern red oak or something that, is already on the southern edge of its range here. A sugar maple, right? For example, that's, really too hot in Washington, D.C. for, even though they used to be here.
So you're telling me, Thomas, that the northern red oak that was 100 plus years that I just lost, I can put in a southern live oak, which is my dream tree.
Aren't these gorgeous? We are working with Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, and they are in year 12 with some southern live oaks that they got from Richmond, Virginia, which I think is the northernmost kind of site that they're there. But they've been in Brooklyn, New York for 12 years now and are growing quite well. So again, with the zone pushing, like you said, who knows if winter like we had last year would kind of trim that back. But I do think there's a case for it, because I think some of these species, because of the roads we have and everything else, they don't have the ability to naturally shift the way they would kind of in a pre-colonial sense, like as heat and climate has changed before, but glaciation's changed mixes. But previously, these species had the ability to move, and they had thousands of years to do it. Now, the climate's heating at such a fast time, and it's really hard for, a tree in Alabama to make its way up here. So I do think, thinking about being provocative and pushing some of that, I think it's a triage time. I know some people think it's reckless to think about, going farther south, but I would really push people to think about not just going south, but just broadly diversifying the kind of plant choices for a climate that's going to be much hotter. Just as a quick aside, there's some really great resources online, like climate mappers that'll say like what your zone is going to look like in 2060, like how hot it'll be. So kind of thinking about plant selections, especially like a tree, if you're going to plant a tree in your yard through the lens of like what would be can handle 2060 type conditions. I think that's, the sugar maple doesn't make that list anymore, right? Or the Betula populifolia, some of those cold species that used to maybe be on the edge of this area just don't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was thinking about a lot of the plant breeders that I talk to and the work they're doing. So they're obviously working for plants that have beautiful flowers or great taste if it's an edible plant, but they're also looking at climate change. They're also looking at plants that can take, much broader range of temperatures.
Yes.
One of the things is the fluctuation.
Yes.
And then also can handle the deluge one weekend.
Yes.
And then drought for 6 weeks. And how many plants can handle that, Thomas?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think you're right. It's not just heat. It's climate volatility. And so I think a lot of like what we're writing about in this new book is really, there are some species that have evolved to be stress tolerating specialists. Think about like the orchid, living in the rainforest in a very specific niche within the tree, or certain like really stressful plants growing on granite rocks that can handle the stress. They're kind of one type, and a lot of our native plants kind of find their way in that category. But there's quite a lot of other species that are more like competitive generalist. A wide amplitude of ecological conditions, really can handle from flooding to drought, all that kind of stuff. And those kind of competitive generalists are really what we're thinking more and more about building our plant list around. And there are many natives that fit in that category. It's not that's a non-native category. Although many of our invasive species, that's exactly why those are thriving, is that these competitive generalists are outcompeting the specialist. And that's kind of the biodiversity crisis in a nutshell. But it really requires sometimes, and this is where I think the ideology around native plants sometimes doesn't really separate the stress-loving specialist, which is not going to do well in my Arlington clay, and that's going to get eaten up by the bullies all around it. They're meant to survive stress, but they can't handle competition and volatility.
And beside the weed pressure, I was also thinking deer pressure.
Deer, yeah. There's a whole nother category. Deer essentially browsing out the entire replacement for the eastern deciduous forest right now. So the natives' ability to recover. There was a study that came out in Pennsylvania talking about how certain forests have almost zero native recovery because the seedlings are being browsed out and they're leaving the invasives. So you have kind of a whole category of herbivory that's reshaping the next generation of trees in a way that's not great. So there's some serious like challenges, and I think planting is up for the challenge. We just have to reframe kind of what plants' roles are. Like we have to really think about plants can live in this area. The invasive species pressure is so heavy. Weed pressure is so heavy. It really requires thinking about natives and ecological species that can survive the volatility, deer pressure. That there are plants that do all of that. So, the good news is, I really think plants are amazing and they have the ability to do that. But we just have to kind of frame the conversation around really specifically addressing these challenges.
And can you give a couple examples of those? I'm thinking in particular Ardrewbeckias, right? I find them to be super tough, and I really have never, I don't think ever watered a black-eyed Susan.
Yeah, that's a great example. Rebecca's are workhorses in a garden. A lot of times what we're really trying to do is to build, think of on our projects, we're thinking about okay, what is a green carpet we can make? So we come up with these kind of perennial mixes, and the mixes are a mix of mostly native herbaceous plants. And they'll go under trees. They can go in shade, they can go under shrubs, they can go under a lot of situations. But we spend a lot of time just figuring out how to build a carpet. And so that can include, if you want to include ornamentals like, catmints and nepitas and things like rudbeckias. It can include ground covers, a native Erigeira and a fleabane, Erigeira and Lynnhaven's carpet. That's like a winter green one that creeps and has a really pretty white flower when the daffodils are up. But it does really well in the shade. We use plants like Pachyra aurea and abovata, which can be a little bit aggressive, but underneath like a tall panicum or some taller grasses, as a mix, it's great. A lot of our mixes have slow rhizomatous plants, kind of like self-healing plants. It's a great aster called Aster Twilight. It's about 15 inches tall, and it kind of very slowly spreads in a clump, blooms in August. But it, kind of fills in gaps around those areas. And then even like sometimes we'll think about a few self-seeding plants that are really short so that, as we're building, as a disturbance happens, we're trying to build our own weed banks, select the weeds that we want. So even like the really popular evening primrose, the Nether speciosa, the little, which can be kind of aggressive if there's a lot of gaps. But when you have a very closed system, it kind of seeds its way in. There's a wild petunia, Ruellia humilis, which is a good example of a kind of a dynamic gap filler that we'll sometimes use in very low percentages. But just when there's an opening, it kind of fills the gap. So you're least likely, at least the weeds eventually will kind of be more likely to be chosen by you rather than at random.
I love that. Choosing our own weed bank. And Ruellia is one that I've been introducing more to my pollinator hill strip as a filler. And I think that's a great one. Another one that I'm introducing there is a lot of different Monardas.
Yeah.
And getting hopefully a nice mix of them, because I find they're short-lived. Some of these perennials might be great for 3 to 5 years, and then they kind of peter out.
Yeah, and I think that's another great thing. Yeah, it's like building a plant list based on very stable ground holders. Like there are some perennials that will last decades, and there's some, as you said, that are quite dynamic and won't last long. Like the Rudbeckia hirta in a meadow is typically a 2-year, comes in a year or two and disappears. But some of the other Rudbeckias are like the Goldsturm and the Fulgida varieties are much longer lived. So, really understanding some of the nuance of what can persist for years and what is evolved to be kind of a early successional short-lived plant.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of their lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
The new LinkedIn Hiring Pro can't undo your last hire, the no-show. Who set you back because they didn't show up on day one, or day two, or ever again. And now your product launch is delayed because you're talking to alien abduction podcasters to track them down. But LinkedIn Hiring Pro can help make sure your next hire sticks. In fact, businesses who use LinkedIn are 24% less likely to reopen a role in the next 12 months. Hire right the first time with LinkedIn Hiring Pro. Post a free job today at linkedin.com/quality.
So we're talking about the different layers of plants, and you're creating what's called a dense mosaic or planting module, right?
Yeah.
So it's vertical layers, but it's layers over time. Some are annual, some are perennial, some are reseeders, some are woody plants. This is complicated, Thomas. So
It is
could you,
complicated.
yeah,
No, it
can
is.
you
And
walk us through it? Yeah.
well, I mean, I did the simplest way is like, how do you create a green carpet? Like, how do you create something that'll just hold? And I mean, if you really want to simplify it, I mean, think about like if you have some azaleas, some dry shade, just with some shrubs and a lot of mulch, anywhere you have a lot of mulch, the thing that would get people to start thinking about is what are 1, 2, or 3 kind of herbaceous ground covers you can think about building into and underneath it. So, maybe you pick a native sedge, maybe you pick a spreading green and gold, maybe you pick that wonderful Fleabane I was mentioning, that Lynn Haven's carpet, Erigeron, 2 or 3 things that go together, and then just a native geranium. There's, lots of heucheras, lots of like good kind of perennial ground covers one could do. And then just figure out ways to, start building ground cover. Pick 1, pick 2 or 3, start, especially with some of the spreading ones. It's nice to, start in a few areas. You don't have to cover big areas. But it's that kind of thinking that we're trying to get people to apply to not just dry shade, but kind of everywhere. How do we create a knitted carpet of different species? It does require thinking about there are a lot of layers and a lot of stuff. And, the thing is, like, I think great planting, it is complicated. Like I spent a lot of time earlier when our first book came out, trying to say, oh, it's simple and you can do it too. And I think you can. I mean, I think a lot of people can do some of that stuff, but acknowledging the complexity, I think, is part of it. I think we all need to have a higher level of, as a culture, higher level of knowledge and appreciation around this. And the other thing I would like to do is just like recognize that gardening and professional gardeners is a real expert craft. And more we're going to need people, kind of ecological horticulturalists, who really do understand ecology and ornamental horticulture. And they should be paid a good salary, because that is a worthy profession. It's a high level. It requires years of knowledge. It's not dumb labor, and I think part of like elevating horticulture to not be kind of this lower class level of kind of dumb labor, as sometimes I hear it kind of referred to, or just the way we value kind of the profession, what we pay for that. The more that cities understand that green infrastructure is essential. I mean, what plants could do, like any vision of the green city of tomorrow, you can't have that vision of the green city tomorrow without plants. But it's not plants as ornamental decoration. It's plants as infrastructure, plants as engineering. And so part of my city, yes, it's complicated, but we need great engineers for that. And we should like raise a new class of professionals, and cities should pay good salaries for that stuff, because it cleans stormwaters, it cools cities, it creates the parks that people love. Like, why are parks so ignored and, treated so pitifully? They're some of, the most beloved spaces there. Why are park budgets so low? Why aren't we planting more? So yeah, it's complicated, but I think I'm trying to embrace the complexity, and hopefully we're really advocating for raising horticulture to the level of what it could be, not just decoration, but necessity.
Absolutely. And I love that, raising the level. It is not always easy. I do see, you always see on the internet or somewhere else where it's just saying gardening is easy. Yeah. Planting one plant and getting it to live is easy, but planting a whole landscape, getting it to integrate and live over time is a complicated task. And that's why it's a hobby, and that's why it's never ending. You can put as much into it or as little into it as you want to, right?
Yes.
But as a profession, I totally agree with you that we should be elevating it. And as you said, it's a craft and an art. And so creating those matrix, I love your example of the dry shade with just, mulch under your azaleas. So I'm thinking about also, a typical suburban house with you move in with the turf grass lawn and maybe some little meatball shrubs as a foundation planting. Maybe they put a little circle around a dogwood in the front yard. That would be a typical thing to do, right? So let's start with that circle around the dogwood and try to expand on that.
Yeah, so one thing we're trying to get people to do is to think about planting, like in a suburban setting like that. That's a great example, as continuous So instead of making a planting bed like a floating island around a tree, we would rather see, and this kind of goes back to rethinking the American suburban lawn. So right now, the American suburban lawn, I've said this for many years, is more like a wall-to-wall carpeting.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the way carpeting was used in the 1970s in houses. Remember when there's like carpeting in the bathrooms in the 70s?
Scary.
It's like the default treatment. It's like everywhere. Like you don't know what to do, you put lawn. Even under your trees, even against the fences, even in places it doesn't want to go, we put lawn everywhere. And then plants are these like little objects shoved up against the base of the house, around the mailbox or something like that. And what we're trying to get people to do is to flip the script. And instead of lawn being a wall-to-wall carpeting, if you think of your lawn as an area rug, a nice, it could be a big area rug, but in front of your house, you have kind of a cleanly defined shape, a rectangle, a circle, an ellipse, some clean, simple thing. And then surrounding that beautiful area rug is planting beds. And that kind of flip alone really kind of redefine, like one, it creates a lot of space for planting, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Two is it kind of pulls the lawn away from places where it's hard to maintain or doesn't want to grow. Those areas where it bleeds under a tree or grows on the fence line, which is hard to kind of edge against. And then like for the foundation plants with just meatballs, right? Like if we pull that lawn edge out 10, 12 feet, just a little bit, it doesn't have to be a lot. Those meatballs, which are kind of a vertical wall against the base of the house, could be complemented with kind of a loose, blousy skirt of perennials. Your nepitas, your perennial alliums, salvias, all kinds of, some of these low native, like that Astra I was talking about. You can have this kind of like a loose skirt of herbaceous perennials that really helps transition the height from the shrubs down to the lawn edge and create something loose, blousy, seasonal, introduces some movement into the garden. And frankly, just like requires, like if it's thick enough and well planted, eventually you don't need as much mulch or have to, as the most kind of foundation plants require now. So yeah, flipping the script from wall-to-wall carpeting to area rugs, and then, figuring out in those planting beds, how do you create that kind of green carpet, interlocking groups of low herbaceous species and shrubs, where all that could go.
I would love to see that, and I think most HOAs would be okay with that, right? As
Yeah,
long as
exactly.
you have that expanse.
It's not anti-lawn. It's not throwing out a meadow. This could be a very suburban pattern. It's just, it's actually, I think, making the lawn look better. The lawn all of a sudden looks almost like a terrace,
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I think the lawn makes the planting look better sometimes. Herbaceous plants can turn into a green blob in certain seasons, and like having a really crisply edged and mown lawn against, low herbaceous plantings makes the contrast is lovely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard lawn described in that way as kind of relief for the eye.
Yeah.
Because the beds are so busy and
Yeah.
there's so much going on. The lawn really acts as a neutral area in that case.
That's right. We in our first book we wrote, this is a phrase from Joan Nassauer, a landscape architect, but she talked about naturalistic planting needing these orderly frames in order to help the public perceive them as intentional. And it's true, lawn can be one of those frames that really gives some definition, contrast, and a framework, frankly, to more naturalistic planting and can make it be more acceptable to a wider public.
So in designing plant systems, I'm thinking about the initial installation. You're probably going with plug size plants rather than gallon size, right? And planting much more thickly than your typical traditional landscape installations.
That's a lot of the Fido method, is what we call like a lot of how we do plantings. It really does rely, like we'd rather people have more plants. And so instead of buying gallon size or 3-gallon, perennials that you get at retail nurseries, we're looking for trays of 50, and small landscape plugs that get drilled in. We often will use something like a drill auger, do minimal soil prep when we don't have to do soil prep if the soil's okay. And then using augers, which is kind of essentially like a little drill to drill the holes in the ground and plant. So it's a method of installing plants around 12 to 15 inches on center quickly. And as a result, if they're timed well, if we do a kind of a early May planting, even by mid-June, there's almost no or very little open space between some of the plantings. And by the next season, there's almost none. So it's a way of getting quick infill, which is a big part, like in this area where weed pressure and invasive species pressure are so high. The method of planting matters as much as kind of what you plant. So we do that. Sometimes we have to get gallons. There's some things we can't get in plugs. Quartz is another thing we'll sometimes get, but it's very much, trying to plant a lot. As a home gardener, I don't always have the money to go buy that many plants, as sometimes our clients do. So, I'll get what I can get when I can, native plant sales and stuff like that. And a lot of times I'm looking for plants I can divide or move around. That native, I have one of that air geron, that fleabane I'd mentioned before, the Lindhaven's carpet, that now I have maybe 1,000. It's just I've taken little cuttings at the right time and stuck them under, another kind of like the base of a tree. This is a great plant for the base of a tree. Like the tree roots are growing, but it's dead, and I get a lot of weeds under there. Nothing else. I can't cram a gallon plant in there. I'll take one of those little cuttings and stick it on the ground there. It's done really well.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about also plant swaps and
Yes.
those types of things where somebody has too much of something, or plant rescues.
Yes.
From a house that's going to be torn down. That's a great way to get a lot of free plants immediately.
Yes.
And then looking ahead, once that couple years of establishment, is the ongoing maintenance. And I think that really, Thomas, is where people are getting tripped up. Like, you can establish a gorgeous base, you got all the great laid out plans, but then where are they falling down in the maintenance and follow-up?
That's a great question. And I think, it's a reality that we all have to think about. Part of why we're kind of so adamant about kind of covering ground is because a lot of like what falls apart is a result of bare ground that gets invaded. Sometimes, like if you chose poor plant species, that becomes the maintenance. So, kind of right fit, like, and we do it all the time. Like we're experts in kind of planting design, but it's hard. Every site is hard to predict what's going to do well or not. So we do like diverse. We have kind of, usually we're planting a dozen to sometimes 3 or 4 dozen species in a garden. And some of that's because we don't always know what will win. We have a lead plant, but we have some backups in there. For example, there's one area we just did in a garden in Asheville, North Carolina, that had a lot of prairie dropsy, this like kind of a matrix plants, that the native Sporobolus. But it's very slow to get established. It's a long rooting plant, and it really doesn't cover the ground very well until June or July, where it really bulks up. So we had 2 or 3 other species, like a sedge that's in the cool season, and then another kind of spreading rhizomatous. We had green and gold, and I think a pachyra kind of under there, some phlox obulata, a few species that kind of like filled in the gaps underneath where this plant was, the dominant plant. So in all of our kind of designs, we're thinking about maintenance. And mostly with these kind of green carpets, we're trying to think about designing them a way they get the same maintenance. It's not like a perennial border where this guy gets staked, this guy gets deadheaded, this guy gets a little extra fertilizer. Everything gets the same maintenance. And, if we can use power tools for the cutback, a string trimmer or a mulching mower once a year to kind of mow everything down, that we design many of our perennial mixes so we can get that kind of, everything gets the same treatment, nothing is special. And we find that really cuts down on some of the maintenance.
Excellent. How can our listeners contact you to find out more?
Our website is Phyto Studio, PHYTO, and we have an Instagram at Phyto Studio as well. So we have all of our contact information there. I'd love to hear from you.
Great. I'll put that link in our show notes as well. And final thoughts, Thomas, on a homeowner or home gardener trying to address designing a plant system. Is it sit back and observe for a few years, or would you say jump right in?
I'm a big fan of experimenting, and my garden sometimes looks like a massive experiment. So I I think gardening matters, and I think engagement matters more than anything else I'll say today. So go out there and try something, observe, see how it works. And, sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't. I think it's that process of engagement and of trying and of critically thinking through, why is this gap still here? What's there that is so valuable? My garden teaches me, and it humbles me every single day. This is not, we have the systems language and it sounds scientific and, like we're experts, but it's humbling. It's hard. This is a time where the climate just gets more and more challenging. So I think patient engagement is the most optimistic and hopeful thing any of us can ever do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you, Kathy.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the genius ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
This summer, serve up the Cookout Classics, Oscar Mayer hot dogs and Heinz mustard. Grill up a dog, add classic yellow mustard, or loaded Chicago style. We all know it's not a cookout without Oscar Mayer and Heinz.
Dwarf Comfrey Plant Profile. Dwarf Comfrey, Symphytum ibericum, makes an impenetrable ground cover that is wonderful for swallowing leaves and blocking out weeds. It spreads by underground roots and forms mounds of dark green leaves. The flowers are clusters of peachy yellow bells on the end of tall, nodding stalks. It can grow from full sun to part shade, with reports that it's even thriving in full shade. It is not picky about soil types and is drought tolerant once established. It's in the borage family and has many similarities to that perennial herb. Comfrey is an efficient soil nutrient accumulator. After the first flush of flowers, chop the plants down and spread the pieces around for an excellent garden mulch. Comfrey manure is a rich source of calcium and manganese. Add it to your compost pile, as well as the comfrey leaves act as a bioactivator. The plants will grow quickly again. It can cover an open area and does well on slopes and hillsides for erosion control. It's easily propagated by root cuttings or division. It's difficult to remove all the roots when transplanting it, and it will return, so plant it in a spot where you intend to keep it. Dwarf comfrey is a pollinator powerhouse plant. Adding it near your vegetable garden encourages bees to visit your nearby tomatoes and other plants to pollinate them as well. Beekeepers will especially want to cultivate this ground cover near their hives. It's a desirable ground cover for use under fruit trees and berry bushes. The comfrey's root systems don't compete with that of the trees and shrubs. A solid ground cover of dwarf comfrey eliminates the need to weed whack and mow around the fruit-bearing plants, which protects them from possible mechanical injury. Deer do not find it palatable, and it's free of serious diseases and pest issues. According to plant expert Barbara Malera, comfrey's most significant qualities are related to what the plant does for the garden soil. The fat roots aerate heavy clay soils, breaking them up into much more amenable loam. Dwarf comfrey, you can grow that. This profile was excerpted from the book Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Order today at Amazon.com or bookshop.org or wherever you buy your garden books. What's new in the garden this week? Well, I'm enjoying the blooms on my blackberry lily, leopard lily, and the Rus tiger's eye sumac. Over at the community garden plot, the dill heads are starting to dry, so I've clipped them off to collect the dill seed. In garden tips that we shared this week, we talked all about the summer heat, including that some big trees drop up to 10% of their leaves during hot summer months. This helps reduce water loss from the tree by transpiration. It's a very natural process. Nothing is wrong with your trees. In local gardening events that you might want to attend if you're in the Washington, D.C. region, Washington Gardener magazine will be at the Lotus and Water Lily Festival at Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Saturday, July 18th. Join us there to celebrate all things water gardening and America's 250th birthday. You can find out more about that at the National Park Service website. And then we are participating in the Garlic Festival at the Tacoma Park Farmers Market on Sunday, July 19th from 10 a.m. to noon. They'll have garlic tastes, garlic growing information, and lots more. See us there at the Tacoma Park Farmers Market. And finally, we are hosting our garden photo show opening reception on Sunday, August 2nd from 2 to 3:30 p.m. at Meadowlark Botanical Gardens in Vienna, Virginia. That is open to all. Come and see the winning photos in this year's show.
This is The Last Word by Christy Page at Green Prints with the Letters of the Garden by Faiza Appy. The first letter was hidden in a packet of marigold seeds. Nestled between the folds lay a small slip of paper stained yellow with age. Plant these near the tomatoes. They keep the pests away. They care for each other as friends are expected to do. The handwriting was familiar, my grandmother's. She had been gone for 3 months. I had come to her house to sort through her belongings, to decide what should stay and what should go, but instead I found this, a message, a piece of her. The garden had become wild in her absence, vines sprawling unchecked, weeds claiming every spare inch. Yet, despite the disorder, I could still see the imprint of her careful hands in the places where she used to plant. I knelt, pressing my palm to the earth. It still had warmth, as if she had just been there. I picked up a trowel and planted the marigolds. That night, the words of her note replayed in my mind, mingling with the lingering scent of marigold petals on my skin. The next morning, I emptied the old seed shed, scattering packets across the wooden desk. And there they were, more notes, folded into tiny, delicate squares. Don't rush the carrots. The things of worth take time to mature, but the wait is always worth it. Basil loves tomatoes. They grow better together. People aren't so different. A seed planted in the soil can lead you back to yourself when life feels uncertain. Growth itself is a guide. Each note contains simple gardening wisdom, but woven into the words was something more. Something she had never spoken aloud. A quiet reassurance. A gentle lesson in patience, companionship, and resilience. The paper carried a faint scent of earth, as though the words had been growing there all along, waiting for me to find them. I held the last envelope against my chest, its paper warmed by my touch. The letters she left were meant for me. A soft breeze rustled through the leaves, as if she was answering. Over the next 7 days I planted carrots, basil, lavender, beans. Each seed carried a lesson. Each sprout was a conversation. Then one morning at the back of an old wooden box, I found a final envelope. My name was written on it. My hands trembled as I opened it. Your hands were always like mine, strong and stubborn. You'll do just fine, my love. Just keep growing. I pressed my palm into the soil, tears slipping down my cheeks. The garden would grow again, and so would I. Love never truly disappears. Like a seed, it finds new ways to grow. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at greenprints.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. This episode was made by Real Humans. It was produced and hosted by myself, Kathy Jentz. The Let the Sunshine music interludes are by James Mulvaney. If you like this episode, you may also enjoy listening to GardenDC Podcast, Episode 89, Working with a Landscape Designer, Episode 245, Innovative Approaches to Meadow Plantings, Episode 173, Native Plant Fallacies. You can become a listener supporter by going to the link in our show notes. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Pinterest at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast listening app. Please take a moment to share us on social media with hashtag GardenDC and with your gardening friends so other gardeners can find us too. Happy gardening.